Hello and welcome to this A-level law revision video. My name is Aaron and I am an A-level English, graphic design and law student helping students all across the UK with their revision. Today we're going to be looking at the subtopic of parliamentary sovereignty or parliamentary supremacy, excuse me, depending on what exam board you're sitting. Now, this is one of the it's not going to be a huge topic per se. It's just something that you do need to know um, in terms of things that you could be incorporating into your exam answers. Okay, so let's look at the concept first of all. So one thing that you probably should have already looked at is that Parliament is the most important source of law. So all of the law that we get, or most of the law that we get comes from Parliament themselves. Okay, and this idea of Parliament being sovereign means that it overrides all other sources of law. Okay, so that means that because Parliament is sovereign, any other sources of law aren't as important as the laws that come from Parliament, okay, the legislation that comes from Parliament, if you're looking at the vocabulary. Another really interesting point to make is that they can choose what laws to make and what laws to unmake as well, okay? Now, if we look at our checklist, this is taken from the AQA exam board, but most examples will say something along these lines. So we've got to look at the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy, but also the limitations on it. Okay, let's go forward. So there are some good and there's also some bad about it. So the first thing being that obviously because Parliament is our government, they have the power to make or unmake any laws that they choose. So if they feel that there's an issue surrounding a matter, amazing, they can make the law on that. But the problem with this is that there is no body, so nothing, no other entity or person that is recognised, that should have a S, not a Z, because we're in the UK, that is recognised by the law as having the right to override or to sort of challenge the laws that are set out by Parliament. Okay, which means that if somebody or something doesn't agree with what Parliament has said, they can't do much about it. Okay, and that's where this idea of parliamentary supremacy comes in. Okay. Now, again, a really interesting point is that when we're looking at the doctrine of this, right, it's essentially what it's doing is it's providing it's the most important legal premise of the UK Constitution, and we'll look at what Constitution means in a couple seconds now. But it all it means is that the acts that are set out by Parliament, they have to be followed by the courts and the people, but also, again, going back to this idea of no other body being greater than Parliament or having more authority than Parliament, rather, rules that are made by external bodies, so anyone other than Parliament, they can't override acts of Parliament. And one point that you may want to make is that only an act of Parliament can go against an act of Parliament. Okay, nothing else is strong enough, I suppose you could say, or has enough um, superiority, basically. But there are also some restrictions. Okay, so when we're looking at restrictions, the first thing is that I say first thing. There's two or three things that we're going to discuss. Okay, now this first point here, laws from the European Union. Now this is still very much relevant despite us not being in the European Union anymore. Okay, so laws that the European Union had made were binding to the UK, so we had to follow them, okay? And the reason I've put kind of in brackets is because they didn't, although it seemed like they were overriding parliamentary sovereignty, right? The only reason that the laws that the European Union had made, the only reason that they were had legal authority in the UK is because Parliament said that they could. Okay, and that's in the 1972 European Communities Act. Okay, and that goes on to a case that we'll go to look on in a minute as well. Okay, so this European Communities Act of 1972, what this did was that it gave effect to the EU laws in the United Kingdom. Okay, and that point at the end there is so true. It says that the Parliament itself was only made to seem less sovereign because of the legislation that they had put in place. So it was only because of Parliament that this these laws from the United Nations, from the European Union, could had to be applied in the UK. Okay, Parliament could still change their mind. Then that's what's so crazy about this whole idea about Parliament being supreme and it having authority. Very similarly, if we were to look at something like the Human Rights Act, okay, when we're looking at, you'll learn a bit more about this when you're doing the legislative process. But when a prospective bill or prospective legislation reaches a certain stage, I can't remember if it's first stage or second reading, but basically what it has to make sure that it's compatible to the Human Rights Act, so it's got to fit in with it. Now, if courts say, well, actually it's not, then what they can do is they can issue a declaration of compatibility. Now, what that means is that the courts aren't really doing anything, but what they're doing is they're just sending it back to Parliament. Okay. Now, a lot of people have argued that, well, because of this, the courts can sort of just overrule it. The courts can just overrule if it's not in line with the Human Rights Act. Well, again, no, that's not entirely true, because they're not overruling it. All they're doing is sending it back to the person who made the law in the first place, or the person, I say Parliament being the person. But again, interestingly, if Parliament wanted, they could just get rid of the Human Rights Act, and again, that's what's crazy about it. If Parliament don't agree with a law that they have made, or it's blocking them from doing something, then they will get rid of it. They have the power to do that. And then we look at a really important case of Thorburn v Sunderland City Council. Okay, and this is the case of 2002. So what this case did was that it made clear that some legislation, some laws are constitutional in their nature. So what this means is that they're basically just the fundamental rules or laws um, that set up and organise how a country or government work. In less fancy terms, they're just really important laws that sort of that support the structure of the government in the country. Okay, and because of this, it was recognised that some laws, like the one we discussed earlier, because this case had to do with the European Communities Act, like we discussed earlier, with laws from the EU, for example, they couldn't be repealed or they couldn't be cancelled slash revoked because they were of that much importance. So, we can see if we go back to our first slide that we looked at, we go to this and we see, just as an overview, first of all, Parliament is the most important source of law, and it's also the one that overrides any other sources of law, which means nothing can contradict it, nothing has the power to contradict it. Because Parliament is sovereign, that also means that they can choose what to make laws on, whether they want to make a law or whether they decide that actually a law needs to be changed, or they can unmake it as well.